Does the actual data fill in the gaps that the Fed still has in its kind of little sort of guide as to what the US economy is doing? If the industrial data's there, if the PCE number picks up, does that make March a real probability?
I think what the Fed has been trying to do is get the next 3 meetings all up there as potential dates, and then I think it really does depend, as you say, on the data flow. I think we are going to need some upside surprises personally to get March as a rate rise, just because the optionality is still there to wait a couple of months. The asymmetry in risks that they face. I think we had some interesting, inflation expectations still very low. So the doves on the committee are going to be pretty relaxed, I think, about the asymmetry of risk. Unless we get an absolute blowout employment report next week, I think probably not much. But I think it's very much live.
Donald Trump's speech this week, being closely followed. Is politics more important than data at this point? What am I listening to this week? Am I listening to the data? Am I listening to Janet Yellen? Or am I listening to what Donald Trump, the president, has to say? I
mean, I think in general the data has been dominating. I think this reflation trade predates Donald Trump. We're seeing a really, you were talking about Europe. It's not just Europe, it's all around the world. A very synchronized upturn in the data. And I think that's really what's driving risk sentiment. I think people are looking for specific political risks to knock that off. I think in the US, I think we're looking for a little bit more clarity around tax reform in particular. I think the border adjustment tax is still the big unknown about, is that going to be something that the White House is going to get behind, or are they, similar to some of Donald Trump's previous remarks, are they cooling off? Similarly on trade, again, sounds all a bit more reassuring these days. You can see a route to a NAFTA deal. The relationship with China seems relatively functional at a staff level between the US and China, but there's still these risks about kind of unpredictable action. So I think politics is, if anything, it's about risk to the downside, now are they going to materialize or not?
Rupert, I'm glad you mentioned the border tax. That was the center of my reading. We've got some morning must-reads coming up in the next hour on the export analysis. Is this the week where we realize the story's more complex than the simple certitudes coming out of the election? As we launch into March, as we launch to the Fed meeting March 15th, is this where we confront the complexity of maybe tax reform, maybe budgets, and maybe the debate over the border tax?
I think you're right that we're going to get the complexity. I don't think we're going to get resolution this month. I think this is going to drag on. I think the key unknown at the moment in the picture is or even is there a White House attitude to the border tax? We know that there's pretty strong support in the House. Although some signs that there are perhaps individual congressmen kind of getting a little worried. Senate much more noisy. If it's going to happen, I think it does need the White House to kind of come in behind it and use their Trump megaphone to back it. And I think that's what we hopefully will get tomorrow, and then in a couple of weeks' time when we maybe get a plan out of the White House is this part of their plan, or are they just happy to junk it and go for a simple tax cut, and they're not going to go for an ambitious reform?
I look at this. Bring up the chart, if you would, here right now. We're doing this quickly here, folks. This is the Trump reflation trade. We've shown this a million times since November 8th. And the basic idea here is this sort of resistance, if you would, or support, I should almost say, where we rolled over here. This is the doubt about the Trump reflation trade, but we haven't really broken through. Here we are November 9, here we are before the election, and we're still nicely elevated. And Rupert, that shows the indecision that we're in right now, whether it's the US or Europe. Do you carry this indecision right over to the United Kingdom and to Europe?
I think that Europe, generally, I think it's very, very important. We were hearing earlier, I totally agree. I think the data in Europe is very, very strong. And it's interesting that European assets have not really been following that data, particularly European equities lagging behind the US. I think that, personally, that's a risk you probably want to own. I think what's holding it back is concerns about political uncertainty, the French elections, maybe longer term, the Italian elections. But when it comes to France, certainly, I think that it's probably European equities are a pretty good bet because they're being held back by political risk. And if that political risk gets resolved in the way that the markets like, you could see a fair amount of catch-up.